The sound of a newborn cry broke the silence of the early morning, flooding the small hospital room with a mix of joy and relief. For Charles and Sydney, that cry was the echo of a miracle, the cry of life they had waited so long for. After years of struggle, pain, and disappointment, they finally held the most precious treasure of their lives in their arms, their daughter Zoe. But as they held their little one, their eyes filled with tears, neither of them could imagine that this long-awaited beginning would also bring unimaginable challenges. Charles and Sydney, a couple united by unbreakable love, had dreamed of this moment since the day they got married. Their story hadn't been easy. For 5 long years, they tried to conceive a child, facing each month with the hope that this time would be different, only to be dragged back into despair. Visits to doctors, costly treatments, and constant tests that seemed endless had left them exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The pain of infertility had tested their relationship. Sydney, in particular, felt deeply hurt, burdened by the weight of a society that often measures a woman's worth by her ability to become a mother. Charles, though trying to be strong for both of them, also felt torn inside. He saw his wife's suffering and, although he wouldn't admit it, he too feared they might never become parents. Yet in the midst of darkness, they never lost faith. Every night they would hold hands and pray together, begging for the miracle that seemed so elusive. And one day, when they had almost lost hope, the unexpected happened. Sydney was pregnant. The news came like a ray of sunlight in the midst of a storm, brightening their lives with a joy they had nearly forgotten existed. The pregnancy was a period of excitement and fear. Each doctor's visit, each ultrasound, was a reminder of how fragile their happiness could be. But Sydney was strong, facing each challenge with a determination only a future mother could have. Charles, on his part, never left her side, ensuring that nothing could go wrong. And so, on a bright spring morning after 9 months of anxiety and hope, Zoe came into the world. When the nurse placed the little one in Sydney's arms, all the scars of the past seemed to heal instantly. Zoe was perfect, the culmination of all their dreams, the living proof that love and perseverance could overcome any obstacle. From that moment, Charles and Sydney's lives changed forever. The house that once felt empty and silent now vibrated with the sound of a baby's laughter and cries. Everything they had suffered was worth it every time they looked at their daughter, and every sacrifice became insignificant as they felt her tiny hand clutching theirs. Charles, who had always been a practical and rational man, found himself daydreaming about his daughter's future. He imagined taking her by the hand to the park, teaching her to ride a bike, and watching her grow into a strong and brave woman. Sydney, on the other hand, delighted in the simplest moments. The first time Zoe smiled, the way she nestled into her chest to sleep, the peace she felt, seeing her little one breathe peacefully in her arms. Now, as a new day began, the sound of the alarm clock broke through the calm darkness of the early morning, signaling the start of a new day. Charles, still half asleep, reached out to turn it off, while Sydney turned to the other side of the bed exhausted. Fatigue had become a constant companion, a silent burden that both carried, unaware that within that exhausting routine, a threat was lurking, soon to put everything they had built to the test. Days began to blur into a succession of hours that intertwined, almost indistinguishable from one another. Charles and Sydney's life, once filled with moments of reflection and tenderness, had now transformed into a constant whirlwind of responsibilities. Zoe, with her boundless energy and curiosity, typical of a child her age, remained the center of their universe. But the fast pace of life had begun to take its toll. Charles, a man committed to his work, saw his hours at the office stretch longer and longer. His demanding and unsympathetic boss constantly asked him to stay late, and Charles, wanting to ensure a comfortable future for his family, accepted without hesitation. Sydney, for her part, had immersed herself in household chores and caring for Zoe, finding less and less time for herself. The conversations that once flowed easily between the couple were now replaced by quick comments about the day's obligations or the problems they faced at work. Zoe, now 7 years old, was a bright and happy child, but she was also beginning to notice the small changes at home. She no longer spent as much time with her parents as before, and although they loved her deeply, The daily routine had begun to erode the closeness they once shared. The little girl, with her innocent understanding, couldn't fully grasp why Mom and Dad always seemed so busy and tired. Mornings in the Gonzalez household had become a whirlwind of activity. Charles would leave early after giving Zoe a kiss on the forehead, who was usually half asleep when he said goodbye. Sydney hurried to prepare breakfast, dress her daughter and take her to school before attending to her own responsibilities. The days merged into a monotonous routine where quality time with Zoe was limited to the brief moments before bed when she was already exhausted from the day. The communication between Charles and Sydney, which had once been the cornerstone of their relationship, had started to crumble without them noticing. Both believed they were doing their best for their family, but in their efforts to fulfill their duties, they began to neglect the most important thing: time together. The small warning signs, such as Sydney's growing impatience or Charles's accumulated stress, were ignored, covered by the belief that they were building a better future. Weekends, which used to be a refuge for the family, became filled with commitments and unfinished tasks. Sydney used those days to catch up on things she hadn't been able to do during the week, and Charles often brought work home, trying to make up for lost time at the office. Zoe, although trying to get her parents' attention, found herself increasingly alone in her play, learning to entertain herself. Despite everything, the family remained united, but cracks were beginning to appear. In the midst of that routine, the real threat wasn't physical exhaustion, but the emotional disconnection that was slowly setting in between them. Daily life had started to steal what they valued most: the time to enjoy each other, to remember why they had fought so hard to have Zoe in their lives. Friday began like any other day in the Gonzalez household. Charles and Sydney woke up early, prepared breakfast, and helped Zoe get dressed for school. While Charles was tying his tie in front of the mirror, Sydney made sure their daughter's backpack was ready. The morning routine, as mechanical as ever, passed without apparent disruptions, but beneath the surface, both parents were immersed in their own thoughts. Charles, worried about the mountain of work awaiting him at the office, barely noticed when Sydney reminded him it was Friday, the day he was supposed to pick Zoe up from school. She, for her part, had an important meeting that afternoon and trusted that Charles would fulfill his part of the arrangement. But the day was already destined to take a wrong turn. Sydney took Zoe to school as usual, kissing her on the forehead and promising that Dad would pick her up later. Zoe, in her neat uniform and colorful backpack, entered the building without suspecting that this day would be different from the others. The little girl, with the innocent confidence of her young age, had no idea of the storm brewing around her. At the office, Charles immersed himself in his work, increasingly absorbed by his boss's demands and the pressures of looming deadlines. The hours flew by, and what should have been a simple morning of work extended well into the afternoon. The stack of papers on his desk seemed to grow instead of shrink, and every time his phone buzzed with a reminder, he quickly turned it off to avoid losing focus. Meanwhile, Sydney, busy in her meeting, didn't notice the time until it was too late. When she finally glanced at her watch, she felt a chill run down her spine. Her meeting had lasted longer than planned, and she hadn't heard any call from Charles, making her assume everything was in order. But unease began to grow inside her, a feeling that something was wrong. Zoe, for her part, waited patiently at the school gate, watching as her classmates gradually left. Minutes turned into hours, and impatience began to settle in the little girl. She looked around, searching for her dad, but the street was empty. Then she remembered that she knew the way home. She had walked it many times with her parents. She decided that instead of waiting longer, she could be brave enough to make it home alone. With her backpack on her back and her lunchbox in hand, Zoe started to walk. Each step took her further away from the safety of the school and closer to an uncertain destination. The street, which usually felt familiar and safe, now seemed a little bigger and lonelier. But Zoe was a determined child, and though she felt a slight fear, she convinced herself she could do it. Meanwhile, Charles, unaware of what was happening, continued with his work. It wasn't until he finished sending the last email of the day that he realized the time. He looked at his watch, and suddenly panic hit him with full force. He had forgotten to pick up Zoe. His mind filled with images of his daughter, alone and waiting, and guilt immediately overwhelmed him. Without wasting another moment, he rushed out of the office, his heart pounding as he tried to call Sydney to inform her. Sydney, who had just left her meeting, felt a knot in her stomach when she saw Charles's name on her phone. She answered quickly, and upon hearing her husband's distressed voice, fear took hold of her. Both realized the gravity of the situation at the same time. Without wasting any time, Sydney hurried toward the school, but in her haste as she boarded the bus, she lost her purse, leaving her without money and without her phone. The anxiety within her grew, but she couldn't stop. She needed to find her daughter. Back on her way, Zoe walked steadily, trying to remember every turn and corner. But as she went on, she began to feel increasingly lost. The houses that once seemed familiar now looked strange, and fear started to seep into her small heart. She decided to cross a street to take a shortcut, and that was when her lunchbox fell to the ground, rolling toward the road. The afternoon was slowly fading, and the sun began to paint the sky a soft orange hue. Liam, a middle-aged man who usually was meticulous and cautious, was driving down a quiet street on his way home. He had had a long day at work, and his thoughts were scattered, drifting between fatigue and the tasks that awaited him. As he turned a corner, his mind was anywhere but on the road. Without thinking of the danger, Zoe ran after her lunchbox, determined not to lose her favorite one. That was when Liam saw her, or rather when he didn't see her in time. A small figure suddenly appeared in his line of sight, running into the street. Time seemed to slow down. His brain registered what was happening, but his body was slow to react. He slammed on the brakes with all his might, but the tires screeched on the hot asphalt, and before he could stop, he felt the impact. Zoe was inevitably struck. The car came to an abrupt stop, and for a moment, the world was engulfed in a terrifying silence. Liam, with trembling hands still gripping the steering wheel, felt his heart stop. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Every fiber of his being wished it was just a nightmare, something he could wake up from. But it wasn't a dream, and reality hit him with devastating force. He flung the car door open and rushed to the small figure now lying on the road. It was a little girl, no older than 7, with a small backpack on her back and a lunchbox scattered beside her. Her pale, soft skin contrasted with the dark stain beginning to form on the pavement beneath her. Liam fell to his knees next to the girl, his hands shaking as he tried to find signs of life. Fear paralyzed him for a moment. He couldn't think, he couldn't breathe. But deep within him, something ignited, the instinct to survive and the urgency to save this little life. With a swift movement, he carefully lifted her, feeling how fragile she was in his arms, as if holding a dream on the verge of vanishing. He placed her in the back seat of his car, making sure her head was gently supported. He slammed the door shut and ran to the driver's seat, starting the engine with trembling hands. There was no time to think about the consequences, about what might happen if someone saw him. The only thing that mattered was getting the girl to the hospital as quickly as possible. The car sped down the street, the buildings blurring around them. Liam kept one hand on the wheel and the other on his phone, trying to call the hospital to alert them that he was coming in with an emergency, but the words wouldn't come out. His throat was dry, and all he could manage was to desperately mumble that he needed help. Meanwhile, in the back seat, Zoe was unconscious, her breathing weak and shallow. A small stream of blood ran down her forehead, leaving a crimson stain on her pale skin. Liam glanced at the rearview mirror every few seconds, his heart pounding with a mix of panic and desperation. "Hang on, little one, hang on," he murmured to himself, as if his words could keep her alive. The nearest hospital was just minutes away, but each second felt like an eternity. Liam took a shortcut through less traveled streets, ignoring traffic lights, unconcerned about speed limits. His only thought was to get there in time. The image of the girl, so small and fragile, was etched in his mind, and guilt consumed him with every kilometer he drove. Finally, the hospital came into view, a white structure gleaming in the fading daylight. Liam swerved sharply toward the emergency entrance, stopping the car abruptly in front of the door. He jumped out, shouting for help, and soon a group of doctors and nurses hurried to the car. They carefully pulled Zoe out, placing her on a stretcher as Liam tried to explain what had happened. His voice was barely a whisper, his mind still trapped in the horror of the past few minutes. "I hit her. It was an accident. I didn't see her in time," he repeated, unable to stop the tears from filling his eyes. The doctors wasted no time. They quickly moved Zoe inside the hospital, while one of them asked Liam to stay outside and wait. But how could he wait? His heart was with that little girl, the one he had hurt unintentionally, and now he didn't know if she would survive. He collapsed into one of the waiting room chairs, his hands trembling as he covered his face, unable to face reality. Inside the hospital, the situation was critical. The doctors worked quickly and with precision, but the severity of Zoe's injuries became immediately apparent. She was suffering from an internal brain hemorrhage, and although they managed to stabilize her temporarily, they knew the girl needed urgent surgery, one they couldn't perform at this hospital due to the lack of specialized equipment. At that moment, the head surgeon came out to speak with Liam. "The situation is grave," he explained, with a calmness that only experience in extreme situations could bring. "We need to transfer her to a better equipped hospital. Every minute counts. Do you have a place in mind?" Liam, still in shock, didn't hesitate. "Take her to the city. I know a hospital there that has everything she needs," he responded, his voice breaking at the end. He knew it was a risky decision, but there was no other option. The doctor nodded and began coordinating the transfer, while Liam prepared for the longest and most terrifying journey of his life. They loaded Zoe into an ambulance, and Liam decided to accompany her. He couldn't leave her, not after what had happened. During the journey, Liam didn't stop praying, pleading for the life of that little girl, knowing he couldn't live with the guilt if they couldn't save her. Meanwhile, Sydney, with her purse lost and no phone, ran as fast as she could to Zoe's school. Her mind was flooded with chaotic thoughts, each worse than the last. "Where is she? Why isn't she at school? What has happened to her?" she repeated to herself, her feet barely touching the ground in her rush to get there. When she finally reached the school, the place was nearly deserted. Most of the children had already left, and only a few teachers remained, finishing their daily tasks. Sydney burst into the entrance, desperately searching for her daughter. "Zoe, Zoe!" she screamed, her voice trembling with panic as her eyes scanned every corner. But there was no sign of her daughter. At that moment, Charles arrived, panting from the run he had made from his car. Seeing her, he rushed towards Sydney, but the anguish and panic on his face only confirmed her worst fears. "She's not here," Charles said, his voice broken, and Sydney felt her world collapsing around her. "How could you forget her?" Sydney screamed, her voice filled with pain and rage as she pushed him hard in the chest. "It was your responsibility to pick her up. You were supposed to be here." Charles, overwhelmed by guilt, tried to defend himself, but his voice was barely a whisper. I know. I got caught up at work. I lost track of time." "You lost track of time?" "Charles, we're talking about our daughter. You can't just forget her." Sydney was beside herself, her eyes filled with tears of anger and desperation. The tension that had been building for weeks exploded in that moment, and all the pain and fear they felt turned into a fierce argument. "And you, where were you, Sydney? You could have called me to remind me. She's your daughter too," Charles retorted, his voice filled with a desperation he couldn't contain. He knew they had both failed, but the pressure of the moment made him say things he would never have said under different circumstances. "Don't you dare blame me, Charles. I lost my purse, I didn't have a phone, but at least I was thinking about our daughter. You were at the office, as always, buried in your work, forgetting what really matters." Sydney's words were like lashes, each one striking Charles hard, intensifying his guilt. The two stood in silence for a moment, both breathing heavily, aware that this argument wasn't bringing them any closer to finding their daughter. However, the reality of what was happening became even more overwhelming. "We have to find her, Charles. We have to find our daughter," Sydney whispered, her voice breaking as tears finally overflowed. Charles nodded, feeling the weight of desperation take hold of him. "Yes, I know. We'll find her, Sydney, I promise," he said, trying to sound sure, though inside he was terrified. They headed to the principal's office, who had already been alerted to the situation. "We're doing everything we can to find her," the principal said gravely, trying to calm the couple. "We've spoken with the teachers and some of the students. No one saw Zoe leave the school. We've called the police, but in the meantime, I suggest we search the surrounding areas." "I can't believe no one noticed she was alone," Sydney cried, desperate. "She's a little girl. How could they let her leave without supervision?" "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Gonzalez," the principal responded with a tone of deep regret. "We did everything we could, but Zoe is a smart girl. We believe she decided to leave on her own, thinking she could get home by herself." Those words were like a dagger to Sydney's heart. "She should never have had to make that decision," she exclaimed, her voice breaking. "She's just a child. How could this happen here at the school?" As they spoke, an incoming call interrupted the conversation. The principal took out his phone, listened for a moment, and his expression became even more serious. "I've been informed that a girl matching Zoe's description was hit by a car and taken to a nearby hospital," he said, his voice shaky as he tried to remain calm in the face of the shocking news. Time seemed to stand still. Sydney felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, and her legs weakened. "No, it can't be," she murmured, shaking her head as tears streamed down her face. "No, my little girl, no." Charles, on the other hand, felt a wave of anger, despair, and fear hit him all at once. Without saying a word, he grabbed Sydney's hand, and they both ran out of the school, their hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and hope. They didn't know what awaited them, but they had to get to the hospital as quickly as possible. As they drove to the hospital, the silence between them was so dense it was almost palpable. Sydney couldn't stop crying, and Charles, though trying to stay strong, felt that each kilometer they traveled brought them closer to the abyss. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they arrived at the hospital. Upon entering the hospital, they headed to the reception, where a nurse confirmed that a girl had been admitted after an accident. "She's been transferred to another hospital because we don't have the necessary equipment for her care," the nurse informed them as they tried to process what she was saying. "How serious is it?" Charles exclaimed, his voice filled with panic. "I don't have all the information, sir," the nurse responded, her tone professional but compassionate. "The best thing you can do is wait here while the doctors do their work." Sydney, unable to bear the thought of her daughter being in danger, collapsed into a chair, covering her face with her hands as she sobbed. Charles, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, knelt beside her, trying to console her even though he was on the verge of despair himself. "Sydney, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. If I hadn't been distracted, if I had just—" Charles began, but he couldn't finish the sentence. The words caught in his throat, blocked by guilt and pain. "This shouldn't have happened," Sydney said through her tears. "It doesn't matter whose fault it is. Our daughter is in danger, Charles, and all we can do is wait." However, as the minutes passed and no news came, the anguish they felt was indescribable. They didn't know if their daughter would survive the transfer or what they would find when they arrived at the city hospital. The feeling of helplessness overwhelmed them, but they knew they had to stay strong for Zoe. "We need to find her," Sydney said, her voice filled with determination. "I can't just stay here waiting. I need to be with our daughter." Charles, equally gripped by anxiety, nodded, knowing there was no time to waste. They hurried out of the hospital and headed to the car, their hearts full of fear and hope. As they drove at top speed towards the city, the silence between them was a mix of tension and anticipation. They knew the road ahead would be long, but they had no other choice. Every kilometer they traveled brought them one step closer to knowing if their daughter would survive. Meanwhile, inside the ambulance, Liam stayed close to Zoe, watching as the paramedics monitored her condition. The constant sound of the heart monitor filled the space, each beep a reminder of how fragile the little girl's life was. Liam couldn't stop looking at her face, so innocent and peaceful, as if she were just sleeping. Tears blurred his vision, but he quickly wiped them away, refusing to give in to panic. "How much longer until we arrive?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We're about 20 minutes away," the paramedic replied without taking his eyes off the monitors. "She's holding on, but we need to get there as soon as possible." Those words, though somewhat reassuring, did little to ease the burden weighing on Liam. Every second felt like an eternity, and guilt was eating him alive. He couldn't stop thinking about Zoe's parents, about how they must be coping with this situation, not even knowing if their daughter was still alive. The journey was tense and filled with moments of uncertainty, At one point, the ambulance was stopped by the police for speeding. Liam, with a trembling voice, explained the situation to the officers who, understanding the gravity of the matter, allowed them to continue without delay. The siren blared again, and the vehicle sped towards the hospital in the city. When they finally arrived at the hospital, a medical team was already waiting at the emergency entrance. Zoe was quickly transferred to a surgery room, while Liam watched helplessly from the hallway. He knew he had done the right thing, but that didn't alleviate the weight of responsibility he felt on his shoulders. Minutes later, Charles and Sydney arrived at the hospital, their faces marked by anxiety and fear. Upon entering, they saw Liam standing in the waiting area, his shoulders slumped and an expression of exhaustion on his face. Recognizing him, they approached him, unsure of what to expect. "Where is our daughter?" Sydney asked, her voice trembling, her eyes pleading as they met Liam's. Liam looked up, his eyes filled with remorse. "She's in surgery. The situation is critical, but the doctors here have everything they need to help her," he replied, his voice barely audible. Charles stepped forward, his emotions in turmoil. He wanted to scream at this man who had hit his daughter, wanted to blame him for everything, but at the same time, he knew Liam had done everything he could to save her. "Thank you for bringing her. Thank you for not leaving her alone," he finally said, his voice trembling with suppressed emotion. Liam nodded, unable to say anything more. He knew that no words could undo the damage caused, but at least he had done what was in his power to try to make things right. The minutes that followed were unbearable for everyone. Charles and Sydney clung to each other, hoping that time would pass quickly, though each second was torture. Liam, for his part, stood to the side, watching in silence, his heart heavy with guilt. Finally, the doctor emerged from the operating room, his face serious but not without hope. "The surgery was complicated but successful," he announced. "Zoe is stable, but she has a long road to recovery ahead. The most important thing now is that she is surrounded by love and support. Over time, we believe she can fully recover, though there will be challenges along the way." Sydney let out a sigh of relief, her knees nearly giving way as she heard the doctor's words. Charles held her, feeling some of the tension dissipate, though they knew the battle was far from over. The air in the waiting room was thick, filled with a mix of fear and hope. Charles and Sydney had spent the last hours by Zoe's bedside, watching as their little girl breathed with the help of the monitors, her fragile body motionless under the hospital sheets. The anguish of not knowing how much longer it would be before their daughter woke up was eating them alive. But despite the pain, a spark of hope was beginning to ignite. Zoe was alive and had survived the surgery, which was a miracle in itself. Liam, on the other hand, had remained in the hallway, unable to face Zoe's parents after what had happened. The weight of guilt kept him silent, watching from a distance as the couple struggled to maintain their composure. He knew he couldn't continue like this. He had to speak with them, take responsibility for what had happened. Finally, he took a deep breath and approached the room where Charles and Sydney were. As he crossed the threshold, Sydney's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of pain and questions. Charles, who had been sitting by Zoe's bed, slowly stood up, keeping his gaze fixed on Liam. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. Finally, Sydney broke the ice, her voice trembling but firm. "So you're the one who hit her?" Liam nodded, feeling the words catch in his throat. "Yes, it was me," he admitted in a barely audible voice, his eyes full of remorse. "I'm so sorry. It was an accident. I didn't see her in time. I tried to brake, but—" Charles interrupted him, his tone harsh and full of pain. "You tried to brake? Is that all you have to say? My daughter is in that bed fighting for her life, and all you did was try to brake." Liam nodded, unable to defend himself. He knew that any explanation he gave would be insufficient to ease the suffering of these parents. I know, and I'm sorry. If I could change what happened, I would in a second. The only thing I can say is that I tried to do the right thing afterward. I took her to the hospital, made sure she got the care she needed, but I know that doesn't change anything." Sydney, who had been silent, finally spoke, her voice full of conflicting emotions. "Why? Why didn't you call an ambulance?
Why did you decide to take her yourself? Didn't you think you could make things worse?"
"I did it because I was desperate," Liam replied, his tone reflecting his anguish. "I didn't think of anything else but saving her. I didn't know how much time she could wait, and I know it wasn't the best decision, but it was the only thing I could think of at that moment. I just wanted to help her." Silence filled the room again as Charles and Sydney processed Liam's words. They both knew they were in the midst of an emotional storm. Their instinct told them to blame Liam, but they also knew the situation was more complex than it seemed on the surface. Finally, Charles spoke, his voice calmer but still tense. "We can't change what happened, but we need to know that you're going to be there to help us with what comes next. Zoe has a long road ahead, and we can't do it alone." Liam nodded with determination. "I'm here for whatever you need. I'll do everything in my power to help Zoe recover. I'm not a doctor, but I'll do whatever it takes to support you." Sydney, feeling her anger slowly dissipating, sighed deeply. "This is so hard. I don't know how to forgive. I don't know if I can. But right now, the only thing that matters is Zoe. If you really want to help, then focus on her, because we can't lose her, Liam, not after everything we've been through." Liam nodded solemnly, moved by Sydney's words. "I understand, and I'll do everything possible not to fail you again. This situation has shown me how fragile life is, and I'm not going to stand by and do nothing." Charles, feeling a mix of conflicting emotions, approached Liam. "I know you feel guilty, and I know this isn't easy for you either. I'm not one to forgive easily, but I also know that if Zoe is going to recover, we need all the help we can get. So I'll accept you, but not for me, for her." Liam felt relieved by Charles's words, though the weight of guilt still weighed on his heart. He knew things wouldn't be faced immediately, but this was a step towards redemption, towards doing something positive in the midst of the tragedy. The doctor entered the room at that moment, interrupting the tense conversation. "We have good news," he announced with a small smile. "Zoe has responded well to the surgery and is starting to show signs of waking up. However, it's crucial that she's surrounded by people who support her in her recovery. This is just the beginning, and there will be challenges, but with time, we believe she can return to being the girl she was." Tears filled Sydney's eyes as she heard the doctor's words. "Can we see her? Can we be with her?" "Of course," the doctor replied kindly. "But it needs to be a gradual process. We have to ensure that her brain recovers slowly. But you can be with her, talk to her, and that will make a big difference in her recovery." Sydney and Charles exchanged glances, knowing that although the road ahead would be difficult, they would face it together. Liam, in a gesture of respect, stepped back to allow them this family moment, but Charles stopped him. "Stay," he said, his voice still tense but with a tone of acceptance. "If you're going to be part of this, then start now. Zoe needs to feel that she's not alone." Liam, surprised by the invitation, nodded gratefully. He approached Zoe's bedside, feeling a mix of fear and hope. He knew he had a lot to prove, but in that moment, the only thing that mattered was that Zoe knew she was surrounded by people who loved her and would support her in her fight to recover. The days following Zoe's surgery were a whirlwind of emotions for everyone. The hospital, with its cold lighting and endless corridors, became a second home for Charles and Sydney, who refused to leave their daughter's side even for a moment. The routine of watching her every movement, monitoring the beeps that indicated her heart rate and breathing, became part of their daily lives. Zoe remained in a semi-conscious state, struggling to return to the world she had left behind. At times, her eyelids would flutter, as if she were trying to open her eyes, but the effort seemed too great. The doctors assured them it was only a matter of time, that each day brought her closer to recovery, but the uncertainty hung over the family like a constant shadow. Charles, used to being the pillar of strength, found himself battling a torrent of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He sat by Zoe's bed, speaking softly, reminding her of childhood stories, happy moments he hoped would reach some corner of her sleeping mind. "Do you remember when I took you to the park for the first time? You were so small, but you insisted on climbing the biggest slide. I was terrified seeing you up there, but you just laughed and screamed with joy. That's my treasure, my brave little girl." Sydney, on the other hand, found solace in prayer, in the hope that her faith could help her daughter return. Every night after ensuring Zoe was comfortable, she would retreat to a small chapel in the hospital, where she would light a candle and pray silently, asking for a miracle, for the strength to carry on. "Dear God," she murmured, her eyes closed and hands clasped, "please don't let us lose her. She's our light, our miracle. Please bring our daughter back to us." Liam, although not as present in the room, stayed close, offering his support in whatever way he could. He knew it hadn't been easy for Charles and Sydney to accept him, but he was determined to be part of Zoe's recovery as a personal act of redemption. Every day he made sure the family had what they needed: hot meals, medication, and even a shoulder to cry on when the weight of the situation became too heavy. One morning, after an especially difficult night when Zoe had a high fever, the unexpected happened. Sydney was sitting by the bed, gently stroking her daughter's hair, when she felt a slight squeeze in her hand. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but when she looked down, she saw Zoe's fingers moving slightly, responding to the touch. "Charles," she exclaimed, her voice breaking with emotion. "Charles, look." Charles, who was standing on the other side of the bed, quickly leaned in to see what was happening. His eyes filled with tears as he saw Zoe's eyes slowly beginning to open, revealing a flicker of awareness. It was as if the little girl was waking up from a long sleep, her pupils moving with difficulty as she tried to focus on her surroundings. "Zoe, my love, we're here," Sydney said, her voice trembling as she leaned over her daughter. "We're with you, sweetheart. Everything is going to be okay." Zoe blinked several times, her eyes finally focusing on her parents' faces. The confusion and exhaustion were evident, but there was something else in her gaze. A spark of recognition, a small glimpse of the girl she had been before the accident. The doctor quickly entered the room, alerted by the movement. After performing some quick tests, he confirmed what everyone had been anxiously waiting to hear. "Zoe is waking up, and it's a good sign, but we must be patient. The road to her full recovery will be long and complicated. There will be tough days, but the most important thing is that she is surrounded by love and support." The doctor's words were a balm for Charles and Sydney's souls, but they also knew this was just the beginning. Zoe had returned, but she was not the same. The doctors explained that she would likely suffer from temporary memory loss and difficulties in speaking, a common side effect in cases of brain trauma. Still, hope had been rekindled in their hearts. No matter how long it took, they were willing to do whatever it took to help their daughter regain her life. In the days that followed, Zoe began to show more signs of recovery. She could move her limbs with difficulty, and although she still couldn't speak, her eyes followed her parents when they talked, showing that she understood what was happening around her. Charles and Sydney spent hours reading her stories, showing her family photos, and talking about the good times they had shared. Every small response from Zoe, whether a nod of her head or a slight smile, was cause for celebration. Liam, who remained on the sidelines, also felt comforted by Zoe's progress. Although his guilt had not completely dissipated, seeing the girl respond to her parents gave him the strength to keep going, knowing he was doing the right thing by being there. He offered to help with the medical expenses and to coordinate any therapy Zoe might need in the future, determined to ease the burden on Charles and Sydney as much as possible. However, despite the progress, not everything was easy. Zoe had days when she seemed disoriented and scared, unable to remember simple details, like the names of her favorite toys or even basic words. These moments were devastating for Charles and Sydney, but they never let their daughter see them cry. Instead, they clung to the hope that, with time, the Zoe they knew would fully return. One afternoon, while Sydney was sitting by Zoe's bed, the little girl tried to speak for the first time. "Ma, Ma," she murmured with difficulty, her voice barely a whisper. Sydney leaned closer, tears falling from her eyes as she smiled. "Yes, my love, it's Mommy. I'm here." Zoe made a tremendous effort to move her lips again, and this time she managed to say something else. "Pa, she whispered, slowly turning her head toward where Charles was standing, tears in his eyes. Charles quickly moved closer, taking his daughter's hand. "I'm here, Princess. We're all here." That moment, though brief, was a ray of hope for the family. They knew there was still much to do, but Zoe's words were a sign that love and patience were achieving the impossible, bringing their little girl back, step by step. The days following Zoe's awakening were filled with small victories and great challenges. Although the little girl showed signs of improvement, the recovery process was slow and painful, both for her and for her parents. The doctors had warned them that there would be setbacks, moments when everything would seem to stall, and that they needed to be patient and strong. But the reality of facing those difficulties turned out to be harder than they had imagined. Each morning, Charles and Sydney woke up with a mix of hope and anxiety, wondering what the new day would bring. Zoe, though increasingly aware, still struggled to regain her ability to speak and move normally. Words often escaped her, and her frustration was evident in the moments when she couldn't remember or express what she wanted to say. The toys she once adored now seemed unfamiliar to her, and the simplest things, like walking or holding a spoon, required monumental effort. Charles, who had always been the strong man of the family, began to feel the weight of the situation. Despite his determination to maintain a positive attitude, there were moments when he found himself alone in the hospital hallway, fighting back the tears that threatened to overflow. Are we doing enough? He wondered in those moments of solitude, fearing that his daughter might never be the same again. Sydney, for her part, clung to faith like a lifeline. She spent hours by Zoe's bedside, reading her stories and singing the songs that once made her smile. Although Zoe's recovery was slow, Sydney refused to let despair overcome her. She knew that each day was a battle won, and that the only thing that mattered was that Zoe was alive and with them. "Come on, my love, try again," Sydney would tell her daughter as she held her hand to help her get out of bed. "You know you can do it. Daddy and I are here, and we won't let you fall." Zoe, with a titanic effort, managed to stand up, though her legs trembled under her own weight. Each small step she took was a triumph, and although she couldn't help but feel frustrated, her parents' love and patience pushed her to keep going. Liam also played a crucial role in Zoe's recovery. He made sure she received the best possible medical care, coordinating physical therapy and speech therapy sessions to help her regain her skills. Although he still felt guilty for what had happened, finding ways to help the little girl gave him a sense of purpose, a way to atone for his mistake. "Zoe is a fighter," Liam told Charles one afternoon as they discussed the girl's progress. "Every time I see her trying again and again, I realize how strong she is. If she keeps this up, I have no doubt she'll overcome this." Charles, though grateful for Liam's support, still struggled with his own emotions. He had accepted Liam into their lives, but every time he saw his daughter struggling to do something that used to be natural for her, he couldn't help but feel a silent resentment. He knew it was irrational, that Liam had done everything he could to help, but the pain of seeing his daughter suffer was a wound that hadn't fully healed. As the weeks passed, Zoe began to show more signs of improvement. Her words, though still difficult to pronounce, began to return more frequently. The doctors were impressed by her progress, and Charles and Sydney clung to every little advance as a sign that all their effort was paying off. One day, during a therapy session, Zoe managed to say a complete sentence without help. "I want to walk to the park with Daddy," she said in a halting but clear voice. Charles, who was present during the session, felt tears fill his eyes. He knelt beside his daughter and hugged her tightly. "We'll go to the park, Princess. I promise. We'll go to the park and play like we used to." When Sydney heard the news, she was filled with hope. More and more she saw her little girl returning, and although the road ahead was still long, she knew that together they could overcome it. The love they felt for their daughter gave them the strength to face any challenge. As Zoe continued to improve, the family began to consider the possibility of bringing her home. The doctors warned them that the transition would be difficult, that they would need to continue the therapies, and that there would still be challenging days. But Charles and Sydney were determined to do whatever it took to make Zoe feel safe and happy in her home again. Finally, the day came when Zoe was discharged. Leaving the hospital was an emotional moment for everyone. As they wheeled her to the car, the little girl smiled weakly at the sight of the blue sky and the feel of the breeze on her face. For her, it was like a new beginning, an opportunity to rebuild her life. Liam, who had been present to say goodbye to the family, watched with a mix of sadness and relief. He had done everything in his power to help Zoe, but he knew his path with the family was coming to an end.
"If you ever need anything at all, I'll be here," he said before departing. "Don't hesitate to call me."
Charles nodded, grateful for everything Liam had done. "Thank you for being here. I know it hasn't been easy, but we appreciate everything you've done for us." Sydney approached Liam and gave him a hug, something she hadn't thought possible until that moment. "I can't say that everything is forgiven, but I know you've done your best. And for that, I thank you." With those words, the family got into the car and headed home. During the drive, the silence was filled with unspoken emotions, thoughts about the past and the future. But when they arrived home, and Zoe saw her room, her toys, and everything familiar, her eyes lit up with a joy they hadn't seen in weeks. Zoe's return home marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Gonzalez family's life. The little girl, though still weak and struggling to speak, showed incredible determination to regain the life she once knew. Her small achievements, like walking on her own through the living room or remembering the name of one of her favorite toys, were celebrated as great victories by her parents. Charles and Sydney worked together to create an environment of love and support that would facilitate their daughter's recovery. The house, which had been a refuge of silence and worry for so long, began to fill once again with the sounds of play, laughter, and conversations. However, as Zoe progressed in her recovery, both parents realized they too had a journey of their own to complete. Charles, who had carried the guilt and responsibility throughout the entire process, began to feel the emotional impact of what had happened. Although Zoe was improving, he couldn't stop thinking about the moments when he had feared losing her forever. That emotional burden, which he had kept hidden for the sake of his family, began to manifest as anxiety and sleepless nights. One night, after putting Zoe to bed, Charles sat in the living room with Sydney, feeling that the words he had repressed for so long finally needed to come out. "Sydney," he began, his voice low and tense, "I can't stop thinking about everything that happened. How we almost lost her. I know Zoe is getting better, but I can't help but feel like I failed as a father." Sydney, who had noticed the tension in Charles, moved closer to him and took his hand. "Charles, you didn't fail. We did the best we could in an impossible situation. Zoe is here with us, and that's what matters." Charles pressed his lips together, struggling to hold back the tears. "I know, but there are moments when I can't help but wonder if I could have done more, if I could have prevented this from happening. And then there's Liam. I've tried to forgive him, but every time I see Zoe struggling, I feel a resentment that I can't ignore." Sydney listened in silence, understanding the pain her husband had been holding in. "Charles," she said softly, "what we're feeling is natural. We went through something terrible, something that changed us forever. But we also need to learn to let go of that guilt and resentment. We can't let it consume us. We need to heal, not just for ourselves, but for Zoe." Charles nodded slowly, feeling that Sydney's words resonated with a truth he had been denying. "You're right," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I can't keep going like this. I need to find a way to let this go, to forgive even Liam." Sydney smiled faintly, feeling that this was an important step for both of them. "We'll get through this, Charles. Together. It won't be easy, but we'll get through it. And I know that, with time, you'll also see that Liam did the best he could in a terrible situation. We're all fighting to move forward." As Charles and Sydney talked, they decided it was time to confront those unresolved feelings. They knew that their family's healing required more than just Zoe's physical recovery. It also needed redemption and forgiveness, both toward themselves and others. A few days later, Charles decided it was time to talk to Liam. He invited him to his home, knowing that this conversation would be difficult but necessary. When Liam arrived, he was nervous, not knowing what to expect. He had been helping the family as much as possible, but he had always kept a distance, respecting the space they needed to heal. Charles received him in the living room, and after the initial greetings, they went straight to the point. "Liam," Charles began, his voice serious but calm, I wanted to talk to you because I feel there are things we need to resolve. I know you've done a lot for us and I truly appreciate it. But I also know I've been holding on to resentment, and that's not fair to you or my family." Liam nodded, understanding the weight of Charles's words. "Charles, I understand what you're saying. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about what happened, and I wish I could turn back time to change things, but all I can do now is try to help in the best way I can." Charles took a deep breath before continuing. "I've struggled a lot with this, with the guilt, the fear and the anger, but I think that to move forward, I need to forgive you, not just for what happened, but because I know you've tried to make amends. And if I want to be the best father for Zoe, I can't keep living with this resentment." Charles's words were a relief for Liam, who had been waiting for this moment. "Thank you, Charles," he said sincerely. "I can't change what happened, but I'll be here for whatever you need, now and always." The conversation between Charles and Liam marked a turning point in the family's healing process. Forgiveness not only freed Charles from the emotional burden he had been carrying, but it also allowed Liam to feel part of the recovery process. Although the wounds wouldn't disappear immediately, both knew they had taken an important step toward redemption and healing. Meanwhile, Zoe continued to make progress in her recovery. Each day her words became clearer, her movements more steady, and her smile more frequent. Charles and Sydney watched in awe and gratitude as their daughter slowly returned to being the girl she once was, though with a renewed strength that only such a tough experience could forge. One afternoon, while playing in the park, Zoe ran to a swing and asked to be pushed. "Daddy, Mommy, higher!" she shouted with enthusiasm, her laughter echoing through the air. Charles and Sydney looked at each other, smiling with tears in their eyes. Seeing their daughter enjoy life again reminded them how far they had come as a family. The journey had been difficult, but they had found in love and unity the strength to overcome what had seemed impossible. Zoe's return home was an emotional event for everyone. The house, which had been shrouded in tense silence for weeks, once again filled with laughter and the sounds of life. Although there was still much to be done, Charles and Sydney felt more optimistic than ever. The simple fact of having their daughter back home was a miracle in itself. Zoe, for her part, faced her new surroundings with a mix of joy and confusion. While she recognized her room, her toys, and the familiar faces of her parents, there were moments when she felt overwhelmed by everything that had changed. However, with each passing day, the little girl regained more fragments of her former life, integrating the new with what she remembered. The first major challenge was reintegrating Zoe into her daily routine. Occupational and speech therapies continued at home, and although they were exhausting for the little girl, she faced each session with a bravery that moved her parents. The exercises, which at first seemed like impossible tasks, began to bear fruit. Little by little, the words became clearer, the movements more fluid, and the spark in Zoe's eyes began to shine with the intensity of before. Charles, who had taken on a central role in his daughter's recovery, took every opportunity to motivate her. "Do you remember how you used to run through the park, my love? Let's try it together. I know you can do it," he would say, holding her hand to guide her in her first attempts to walk with more confidence. Zoe, though sometimes frustrated by the slowness of her progress, relied on her parents' love and patience. Every achievement, no matter how small, was celebrated as a great victory, and the family grew closer with each step forward. "Daddy, Mommy, so I did it," she would say with a smile that filled Charles and Sydney's hearts with hope. School was another major challenge. Although the doctors advised a gradual return, Charles and Sydney knew it was important for Zoe to socialize with her peers again. The first time she entered the classroom after the accident, all the children greeted her with applause and hugs. Although some things had changed for her, like the need for a personal assistant to help with certain tasks, Zoe felt welcomed and supported, giving her the confidence to move forward. The first weeks back at school weren't easy. Zoe, though excited to be with her friends, found herself struggling with tasks that had once been simple. Reading, writing, and playing became challenges that frustrated her, but every time she felt discouraged, she remembered her parents' words. "No matter how hard it is, we'll always be here to help you." At home, Charles and Sydney also faced their own challenges. Although they had made peace with Liam and started to heal emotionally, They still had to deal with the aftermath of the accident. The medical expenses, therapy sessions, and the constant need for support were daily reminders of what they had gone through. However, instead of letting themselves be overwhelmed, the couple decided to focus on the positive, on how love and unity had brought them this far. One night as they sat in the living room after putting Zoe to bed, Charles looked at Sydney with a determined expression. "We've been through a lot, but I'm starting to see this as a second chance, not just for Zoe, but for us as a family." Sydney nodded, understanding what Charles meant. "Yes, and I think we've learned to appreciate every moment, every little thing we once took for granted. Now we know what truly matters." They decided it was time to take another step in their healing process, focusing on creating new memories and experiences that would strengthen their family bonds. They began planning small trips, outings to the park and game nights at home. Simple things that reminded them of the importance of being together. Liam's role in their lives also began to change. Although he had maintained a respectful distance, ensuring that the family had the space they needed, Charles and Sydney invited him to be part of some of these family activities. They knew that for Zoe, Liam was someone important, someone who had been there when they needed him most. One day while they were walking in the park, Zoe ran up to Liam and took his hand. "Uncle Liam, can you push me on the swing?" she asked, with a smile that melted his heart. Liam, moved by the purity of the gesture, nodded and led her to the swing. As he gently pushed her, he saw Charles and Sydney watching from a distance, both smiling. In that moment, Liam felt he was finally finding his place in this new life, a life marked by redemption and rebuilding. Charles and Sydney realized that true forgiveness wasn't just about accepting what had happened, but also allowing Liam to integrate into their lives in a way that was meaningful for both him and Zoe. Although the wound of the accident would never completely disappear, they had learned to live with it, to bear the pain and turn it into a source of strength. The family and Liam sat on a picnic blanket in the park, laughing and enjoying each other's company. As the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, Charles, Sydney, and Liam felt at peace, knowing they had found a new way to be a family. Zoe, with her renewed energy, ran across the grass, her laughter echoing in the air, a symbol of life moving forward, full of hope and second chances. The story of the Gonzalez family underscores the power of love, perseverance, and forgiveness, but it also highlights the importance of responsibility. A moment of carelessness nearly cost them their daughter's life, reminding us that small decisions can have great consequences. Through their painful journey, they learned that family love and unity are essential to overcoming adversity, but also that we must fully embrace our responsibilities to protect those we love. Resilience and second chances allowed them to heal, but the incident taught them never to underestimate the importance of being present and attentive in every moment. Thank you for joining us in this emotional story. If it inspired or touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those you love most. Remember, family, love, and unity are our greatest strengths. See you in the next video.